Okay, great. Can you guys see my slides? Okay, perfect. All right, well, it is a pleasure to be here and talk to you guys about the art of writing a research statement. My name is Nicole Shu. I'm an assistant professor in the Paul M. Rady Department of Mechanical Engineering, as well as the Robotics Program, Biomedical Engineering Program, and the BioFrontiers Institute at the University of Colorado Boulder. And before I get started, I wanted to give some information about my background, who I am, and why I am qualified to talk to you guys about writing research statements. So, as you guys know, my name is Nicole. I grew up in Riverside, California. I got my Bachelor's of Science in Engineering, summa cum laude, in bioengineering from the University of Pennsylvania in 2014. From there, I got a master's in bioengineering from Caltech in 2015. And then I got a PhD in bioengineering from Stanford in 2020. So actually, I started off in the same lab for my master's, thinking that I would continue to get my PhD from that same institution, but then the lab moved. And so I helped my advisor move the lab, figure out how to set up a new lab at Stanford. And then we actually moved back down to Caltech towards the end of my PhD slash a brief postdoc there. But while in my PhD, I was also the president of the Stanford Women in Fluid Dynamics and the president of Stanford Aerobics and Yoga. From there, I graduated in the midst of the pandemic and I started a postdoctoral position. So I was a National Research Council or NRC research associate at the US Naval Research Laboratory for 2 years. And from there, I joined CU Boulder as an assistant professor and have been here for about 3 years now. In terms of my experience with job offers in academia, I had one offer in 2020 while completing my PhD, and I thought about it for a long time, but after much consideration, I actually declined that because I found the location was a bit too remote. And so I wanted to talk briefly about kind of my rationale for turning down that position as well. So I really wanted to focus more on developing other types of technical skills in a postdoc role first. And then for more personal reasons, the pandemic hit. I wanted to be near family during quarantine. I didn't really want to move to a new place that was quite a small town and not know anyone there. And then I was also single at the time, and I didn't want to move to a small town before finding a partner. So I think in academia, we talk quite a bit about the two body problem. So what happens if there are two academics and then they have to go looking for jobs and hopefully find a place where they can live together. But I jokingly called this my one body problem. I had 3 interviews in 2022 as a postdoctoral researcher at the Naval Research Lab, or NRL, and from there I got 2 offers, which then led me to my current position at CU Boulder. And so I really thought about culture fit in the department. I thought about the overall location, would I enjoy living in Colorado, as well as the community. And I think the community includes, local dance studios that I was interested in joining, but also what does the department look like? Do they care about you as a researcher? And I really felt that when joining this position here. When I started, I actually deferred for a year. So I started my faculty position in 2023 and I hired a postdoc at the time. So I actually helped my postdoc obtain a faculty position last summer, and that includes providing him feedback overall on written materials, practice talks with the lab, your research talk, your vision talk. I'm sure that these are things that the program has already talked about with you, but if not, I have another slide on all of the different components of the academic job market. And I also helped him emphasize certain things in his packet. So, helping me start a new lab, that's a really big deal when you're looking at academic positions, looking at experience working at different types of schools. So he had previously come from private schools. CU Boulder is a public school, also different sizes of schools. So it's nice getting that different experience. And then thinking about how to emphasize his short-term vision, his long-term research vision. What does it mean to be a good mentor? What courses can he teach at various universities? And so that is my summary of different academic job searches. So in terms of different components of the academic job search, again, you will probably talk more about this through the rest of the series, but for the packet, there are some materials that everyone needs to submit for tenure track faculty positions. So that includes a cover letter, a CV, which is more comprehensive than a resume for typical industry positions. And then what we'll talk about today is the research statement, but there's also typically a teaching statement and sometimes an optional diversity statement as well. So that's kind of the first round of materials that you would submit for an academic job search. And then after that, there's an initial screening. So the first round of interviews are typically either a phone call or a Zoom interview. And from there, the search committee at the university creates a short list. So they invite people to visit, which is the second round of interviews. And so this is typically an on-campus interview with a research talk, a vision talk, sometimes a chalk talk or a teaching talk as well. And then the opportunity to meet with other faculty, staff, as well as students at the university to just see if there's a good fit. And really, I want to emphasize that whenever you put together any of your job materials, you really need to focus on the purpose, which includes the purpose of your research, as well as thinking about the purpose of what writing a research statement is. So specifically for research statements, you need to think about highlighting what you have done in the past and what you plan on doing in the future, and really honing into that specific university, that specific department, and tailoring your application for the audience. So your audience will typically be a bunch of busy academics. So these are the people on your search committee. The rest of the department will read your materials as well. And so really being clear, concise, and highlighting why you and why you're choosing this university or department is essential. So that brings me to talking about the goal of a research statement. So when a department or a college hires a new faculty member, they're really investing in you as a person, and they want to believe in your research. So you want to talk about your past, you want to talk about what you're currently doing, and then you want to talk about the future in terms of short-term as well as long-term goals. So at the end of the day, your future employer wants to find a superstar in the field. So you have to make their job easier, as easy as possible, by emphasizing all the key elements of your research and vision for your work. So think about this in terms of what is your legacy? In the future, when you're retired, what do you want people to remember about your research? And that's kind of the key thing that you want to highlight in your research statement. Why would you be a good colleague? Who do you want to collaborate in the department? Have you done your research on the university, the location, other things that really put a personal touch in your research statement? And why is the place you're applying to the right fit for you? So again, you really want to personalize and tailor your research statement to wherever you're applying to show that you're very serious and you're interested. So the overall goal of a research statement is then to clearly communicate what you've done and what you will do. This includes showing skills in communication. So how well do you write? Eventually, how well do you give a talk? You can emphasize things about mentorship. So have you mentored students in the past? What is your mentoring philosophy? And that's typically something that you would highlight in the teaching statement as well. But you can tie in a lot of your statements and kind of emphasize, I talk about mentorship more in my teaching statement, but this is a key feature of a research lab, so I wanted to highlight that as well in my research statement. You want to emphasize funding. So have you gotten funding in the past? Have you helped your PI write different grant proposals before that were successful? And what types of funding agencies and grants will you apply to in the future? You want to emphasize things like what papers have you previously published, what's in the works, are they in really good journals, and then things like leadership as well. So one thing is that everyone wants to feel seen and heard. So you want to make each department, institute slash employer feel special by showing that you've done your research a priori. I think the best research statements show a little personal touch and emphasize, I would like to collaborate with this person for this specific project that I'm detailing in my research statement. Or, for example, I do a lot of research with aquatic invertebrates. And so in all of my research statements, I typically say, I'm looking at the local aquarium in your city, or I would like to make connections with local bodies of water to see if I can do initial field testing. So the elements of a research statement include an introduction. So you really want to introduce your general research area and motivate your work. So that this means, why is your research important? What's already been done in the field? What are you currently doing? How do you fit that research gap? And how do you see yourself contributing to this field in the long term? So again, it's not just about what you have done before, but what you're projecting into the future. And this is something that you guys are already familiar with, writing papers and fellowship applications. Then you want to highlight your previous and your current work. So this is where you show your expertise. So how do you write about yourself and your past accomplishments? So you can think about the broader impacts as well, not just what the research states, but have you had press? Do you do any external service that is relevant to your research? Any previous collaborators that you have and can leverage moving forward as a faculty member in the future? And this is an interesting piece because you want to write truthfully, but you also want to write confidently. And so some people are able to write very confidently about themselves, and other people, it takes a little bit of finessing in order for them to say, yes, what I'm doing is very important and I fully believe in my work. But there is a fine line between confidence and hubris. So you really don't want to overblow or overemphasize your achievements either. It's a very fine line that you guys are walking. And then you would talk about your proposed future work. So what do you plan to do in the future? And this is where you get to craft a really nice story or a narrative. So think about your past. Maybe that starts with you as a child getting interested in, space exploration, and that motivated you to go into aerospace as an undergrad and do research, at Zucro and Purdue. Just think about how you can connect all of those pieces, even if they don't necessarily make a cohesive story. You can craft some sort of a narrative that ties things together. Or, especially if you're interdisciplinary, you can say, all right, I did this thing, and now in the future, I want to combine them or expand what I'm doing. But again, there are different ways of crafting this story. But think about your past, your present, projecting to your future. What are specific research projects that you would have for your lab? Think about the first project that you would start in your group. How big will your lab be? Will you have 5 PhD students at a time maximum, or 15 or 50? What kind of resources and equipment do you need? Again, think about the future impact when you retire. I think that's a really good thought experiment for, in 50 years, what do I want people to talk about at my retirement party? And then again, how will you find funding as well? Because you want the people reading your research statement to feel confident that you're doing good work and you know how to get funding in the future, especially at a time in which federal funding is a little up in the air. And then again, please personalize your statement to the school. So explicitly write about potential collaborators in the department, maybe other departments at the institute, whether your university has certain facilities that are of interest to you, if there are local resources, etc. So you really want to tailor every application just like your cover letter. You would write your cover letter to the institute, and you would write your research statement as if the only people reading this are in that department.
Nicole,
So,
before you
yes,
move on, there's a question about preliminary data. Should they include preliminary data on that in that part when you were, highlighting the slide before when they were talking about proposed work or current work? Right there, the
yes,
second. So you can include preliminary data? I don't mean to
yes.
interrupt, yes, but
Yeah, so I think that's up to you. If you want to include preliminary data, that's great. It's not something that you necessarily need to do as well. So you could propose something that's completely different, which is actually what I did for 1 or 2 of my future research projects. And as long as you can talk about it in a cohesive, cogent way, I think go for it. But certainly the preliminary data helps. Great. So in terms of other elements of a research statement, it's very important to read the instructions for each job posting. So some schools ask for a research statement, others ask for a statement of research, etc. And you really want to show that you're careful and detail oriented. So even though it seems like a very minor thing, I think it's a nice personal touch if you tailor the title of your research statement to whatever the school is calling for. These are also typically 2 to 4 pages. 2 to 3 is very normal. But again, figure out what the job posting itself states. Use a typical font size, a typical margin size, etc. And then it's very nice to think about clear section headings as well. So you want to make use of bolded fonts, underlining certain words, key phrases, etc. And then in addition to your section titles, you do want to emphasize key parts of your statement if needed as well. So if there's, a key research aim that you're talking about, you could italicize that. Of course, you don't want to go crazy there. So you want to make sure that your research statement is clear, it's readable, someone isn't going to miss a key element of your statement, and it looks very clean, professional, and neat. So to that end, you also want to proofread and make sure that you catch typos. And this is a great way for you to fold in your lab mate or maybe your PI or other people who you trust. Maybe it's even a friend. So ask someone else to read over your statement, because the more eyes you have on your writing, the better your research statement will be. This definitely includes catching typos, but a lot of it can also be, I don't really understand this future research project. Can you explain it more? Or can you talk about it with me? And then you can distill with that person, okay, well, what's coming across is not what I have in my head. And then you can finish wrapping up that writing and make it much clearer. So you can pick and choose what advice to follow from the feedback you receive as well. Especially if you ask for advice from 10 different people, you'll get 10 potentially conflicting pieces of advice. So most feedback will be useful, but some advice can be contradictory. So make sure you also talk to experts in your field who have had success on the academic market, especially in the past couple of years. They'll kind of know all of the ins and outs and will have the most recent information. But please don't be shy about asking for help. All faculty members have been on the other side at some point, and we also had to ask other people for help. So we understand what it's like.
Excuse me, Nicole.
Yes.
Could you please expand on the question? They want to know if they can extend their PhD or postdoctoral work for the future. I don't know if you're going to talk about that in a little bit or not. And I told them yes, but I figured you can expand on it more as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's a good idea to think about what you will do differently after your PhD. So you can definitely make the tie that you will continue some component of your PhD, but think about and maybe highlight the differences. Or if you know that your current PI is working on some aspect of your project, have you already talked to your PI about this? Have you figured out how you can diverge the projects a little bit so you're not stepping on each other's toes? I think from the perspective of the search committee, one question is always, how will this student distinguish themselves from their previous PIs? And part of this is also because funding can be competitive. And so if you're competing directly with your professor who has more ties and more time in this field, then your chances might decrease. And so really thinking about how you can take your current work and expand that would be helpful. Nice. Okay. So in terms of thinking about your audience, really put yourself in the search committee's shoes. So make the search committee's job easier. Make sure you address key elements of the job description. So for a research statement, make sure to address all the points they're looking for if they do have explicit instructions in the job call. The search committee might also not be an expert in your particular subfield. It's possible that they are experts, but as you move towards an on-campus visit, you will also interact with more people in the department. And so those people are also not going to be experts in your particular research project. So keep your ideas simple and concise. Make sure to emphasize the big picture. And you should include technical details and expert level ideas, but make sure that you don't lose the main takeaway. So what I like to think about is that your talk in general should be understandable to most people in the audience. And again, you will know who your audience is. But you can go into detail. And so you have general talk, and then you go and say something that only an expert will understand. And then you briefly come back, more general, etc. So that's a way of interacting with lots of different audiences as well. So similarly, you want to do that with your research statement. You also want to emphasize why you. So how do you stand out among the hundreds of applicants who are applying to this job? For example, maybe you can emphasize mentoring skills. So if you mentored an undergrad, or some element of science communication or leadership or something else. But again, just add those personal touches because you want the search committee to also know that you're a person. You should emphasize why the school you're applying to is important for you. So again, tailor your application to the call. Even if your research doesn't fit the call completely, that's totally fine. You should still apply, but really try to make a case for why your research is relevant to whatever the search is. Show some kind of a synergy between you and the school. And then think about what is required for tenure and how you can emphasize these skills. So really, the search committee is looking for someone who would be a successful assistant professor, shifting through tenure into a full professor in the future. So think about the publications. Where have you published before? How many publications do you have? How many are first author? Did you have any press from these? And then where do you see yourself publishing in the future? So, I think it's perfectly valid to talk about how if your research is really interdisciplinary and you're thinking about, I'll give an example from my research, the hydrodynamics of jellyfish swimming, and we find something really cool and interesting, like maybe that's something that could be published in Nature or one of the nature journals. You should also think about funding. So not just in general, I'm interested in applying to funding opportunities, but no, you want to be specific about certain grants, certain agencies, any industry partners. Really do your research beforehand and think about how you can emphasize and make people feel confident in you as a researcher. So when you start writing your research statement, I encourage you to learn what methods work specifically for you. So everyone has a different method that works best for them. I want you to try different methods to figure out how to tailor that for you. And sometimes what used to work for you might not work anymore. So please explore these different options whenever you feel stuck. So typically when I start writing, I think about outlining. So this includes a general list of ideas that I can then organize, rearrange, get feedback on, etc. And I think of outlining in terms of two stages. So one is a bare bones outline, which is more like what you would think of a typical outline. I want to have these sections and I want to emphasize some of these key points. I also encourage all of my students to do this for paper writing as well. But once you have that bare bones outline, you can then have a more fleshed out outline. And you can actually keep fleshing out your outlines until you have a full draft. So start writing polished sentences in your outline. Think about the transitions between the different sections. And so by the time you're ready for your first draft, it's basically already done. So in terms of a first draft, I like to think about a couple of different methods for writing a first draft. And the first is a stream of consciousness version. So just getting all of your rough ideas out there. Don't worry about how it sounds, just get the ideas on the paper. And I think that this is particularly good if you get worked up in your mind. So if you get too caught up in wording and you're thinking, oh, that doesn't sound right, I don't want to write this down, or it takes too long for you to write first drafts, I encourage you to just, set a timer for an hour, keep writing, stream of consciousness, whatever. You can always fix and edit it in the future. And then there's the another side of writing a first draft is potentially going for a polished first draft. So you would write polished sentences as you go. Again, this can take a really long time. Not everyone likes doing this, but it can be good because by the time you finish your first draft, you have a solid piece of writing already. So these are just some ideas. Again, figure out what works for you. Maybe try all of them. And then you have a few different methods for when you start writing your research statements. So once you have a first draft, you're then in the drafting phase. And I want to emphasize that this is iterate, iterate, iterate. You want to make sure you have so many iterations of your drafts because you want to proofread and catch those typos. This is also, as I mentioned before, a nice place to ask someone else to read over your statement. And so in particular, I have a few resources that I myself have used that have been helpful. So the first is the Writing Center. Most of your institutions will have a dedicated writing center, and that means that you can schedule time with tutors to help you at different stages. Maybe this is once you have an outline, you go to the writing tutor and ask about the logic of your outline. Maybe this is, your polished draft, and now you're asking them to proofread. You also want to ask faculty members. So maybe that's your PI or other faculty in the department. And then thinking about asking your peers and your friends as well. So I think it's a good idea to get eyes from both inside and outside of your field so that you get a variety of different perspectives. So your people who are in the field with you, maybe they're your lab mates, know all the technical details and they can help you with those ideas. But people outside of the field will get the big picture and will be able to tell you, okay, this makes sense to me, even though I'm not intimately familiar with your subfield. And then, as I mentioned before, sometimes you get conflicting advice. And I think it's important to think about all the feedback that you're getting from different people because, they're trying to provide you with their perspective. And so you want to respect their time and their help by incorporating as much of their feedback into your draft as you can. That said, I would prioritize experts in the field, faculty who have recently secured academic jobs, et cetera, because those are the people who kind of know what's going on and might be able to tell you upcoming trends first. And lastly, if you feel strongly against their edits or, people are giving you conflicted ideas, do what you think is best. You want to write a research statement that is authentic to you. And I saw a question pop up. Is this a good time to pause?
Yes, actually, it's a great time. So we have a first question that came in. It was rather lengthy, but really, do hiring committees tend to prioritize scholars who focus on one single clarifying defined topic of research or methodology, specialized like quantitative, qualitative, or this person was talking about how they sit at an intersection of two research fields. How is that formed or in things? So you had different types of mixed methodology, get those words out together. So what would that look like or how that would work? I mean, what is the committees looking for? Again, it depends on the university, but
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And the short answer is every committee is different. Who sits on the committee in the department also changes the feel of the committee. So without knowing the ins and outs of that particular university or that search committee chair, I would say be authentic towards yourself and think about if you are focused in one method primarily, think about the different applications there or what are the intricacies of that one method that you can really flesh out. If you're interdisciplinary, I think it's great to talk about that as a huge highlight. I mean, a lot of my work is very interdisciplinary. I sit in the intersection of biology, fluids, and robotics. And so a lot of universities are looking for more interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary research. And I think that's where a lot of the exciting research is. But of course, that's just my bias as an interdisciplinary researcher. So yeah, I think you can make any kind of research direction work. It's just a matter of if it's a good fit between you and that search committee.
mm-hmm. And then there was another question dealing with budgets for startups, because you mentioned you had startups a couple times. Should that type of budget be noted in a research statement or future works, or is that something that's after the fact and you have in negotiating and things like if you got an offer and things like that? Where is that information going to be?
Yeah, that is more after the research statement phase. So you would want to, talk to people after getting at least the first round of interview, if not the second. But if there is some big piece of equipment that you really need for your research, I would highlight that in your research statement as well, just to make it very clear. But yeah, you don't need to put any hard numbers in your research statement in terms of the startup funds.
All right, and then there was one more before we can continue on. Are only grants secured in the U.S. valid, or if I have a grant from another country, how does that matter, or how do I put that information in there?
Yeah, I would still highlight that you have a grant from a different a country as well. I don't think it really matters the origin of the grant. You just want to make people feel confident that you have secured money in the past.
Mhm. Okay. All right, so we're going to let her continue, and then we'll get back to the more questions later. Okay, is that okay? All right, thanks,
Sounds
Tam.
good.
All
Yeah.
right.
So then one additional piece of advice that I wanted to emphasize is that the devil's in the details. So I wanted to clarify why details matter. So this is something like making sure when you give a presentation that things align on the slide, but also when you open your research statement, if you have figures, are your figures kind of like this, or are they perfectly aligned? Is the space around them really nice and neat? Things like that. things like, are your scale bars consistent? Are there typos in your writing? And why do these things really matter? Like making sure that your images are crisp, you have figure labels and captions, etc. So if you demonstrate that you take great care in putting together your documents for the application, then people reading your research statement might apply this to your research. And this is just colloquial information that I've heard from people. So, for example, there was another professor I talked to recently who said, if I see a sloppy talk, I assume that person is also a sloppy researcher. Now, that's not necessarily true, and maybe that's not even a fair assessment, but you want to make sure that your research materials are as good as possible so that you eliminate thoughts like that from other people. And then most people do understand that typos and mistakes happen. I'm sure there's a couple of typos in my talk that you guys have caught, but you want to try to be very thorough about things. It's very important as you put together your materials to really take that time and fix things whenever you can. So try to show attention to detail. I know that you guys care. I know that you guys are great. So demonstrate that you care and that you're great. And look, there's a typo there. And I definitely did that on purpose to show you the importance of not having typos in your slides. So again, this is why it's helpful to copy paste the exact wording like research statement versus statement of research. So things might seem very minor, but those things can add up over time. And I think I saw more questions.
Could I ask you to address something? And this is just based on a theme I'm seeing. A lot of people are asking about funding and what they should say about the funding and budgets and all of that. And I know in my experience and just what I tell clients, this is not about your budget. So could you talk more about how much of this should be about funding and what they should be really honing in on around that topic?
Yeah. So in terms of writing your budget for what you anticipate as a faculty member, you don't need to worry about that for your research statement here. Again, if you have a particular piece of equipment that's really expensive and you want to highlight that's necessary for your work, I think it's a good place to talk about it in your research statement. But in terms of your past funding, I don't, there's no requirement that you need to have any funding in the past in order to secure a faculty position. But people want to know that you are looking at different funding agencies. You know where to apply for funding. Some of this is external, but some of it is also internal. So each university might have, very small grants that they give to faculty as well. And these are typically called seed grants. So at CU Boulder, we have our RIO office, Research Innovation Office. And so I think it's good to highlight where you might find money internally at the university, but also externally, whether that's NSF, NIH, DARPA, etc. And then things like if you received a graduate fellowship, like I was an NSF GRFP student, I highlighted that I had that funding as well. And part of that is in your CV as well. So there's multiple places where you're talking about funding, but I don't want you guys to, freak out that, oh no, I don't have a lot of funding. I won't get any faculty positions. That's really not the point of this. It's certainly if you've had funding, it's great to emphasize that, but thinking about what does it mean to write a grant? Have you taken, grant writing classes? Are you familiar with that? Going to seminars like this is also very helpful because a lot of my advice for, writing a research statement could apply to other types of writing as well. So really emphasizing that you're taking the time and effort to think about funding agencies and how you would get those grants is the key. Great. Any other questions?
We have one on kind of going back to what you were talking about earlier. Could you offer any tips on understanding a search committee's priorities, specifically on whether or not they're looking for candidates with clearly defined topical or methodological things, or like someone whose work spans different areas and approaches?
Yeah, the thing that I've learned on the other side of the search committee now is that every individual member of the search committee has their own idea. And so depending on how vocal they are, how much they clash, the call that's listed online may or may not be what they're actually looking for, which is why I encourage people, even if the call online is tangentially related to your research, just go ahead and apply, try to make things as tailored as possible, make those steps clear so that the search committee can see why you applied. But honestly, you can't really predict what a search committee is looking for. So just do your best, apply to multiple places and see where that goes.
I
Okay,
have an
more
interesting
questions.
one. I have one more.
Yeah.
This is interesting because I've only worked at R1s. So is there a difference between research statements for R1s versus like R2 institutions? Or I know that there's some institutions that are teaching heavy, so they're obviously it's a little different, but is there a difference with the level? I don't think there would be, but is
Mhm.
there? If you're going to go for an R1 institution?
Yeah, that is a good question. And
Yeah.
I've applied to schools that were kind of on the cusp of R2, like just transitioning to being R1. I know people who have applied to teaching institutions, R2s as well. And typically the research statement looks pretty much the same. Where you might emphasize differences are if there are only undergrads at an institute, that I wouldn't list, PhD level types of research unless you have collaborations with local universities as well. But yeah, kind of tailoring what you will eventually do with your future work might be more relevant depending on the type of institution, but otherwise they look pretty similar.
There's a
Okay.
question. Oh, yeah, there's a question. Should the proposed future work have the similar level of details as a grant proposal? No, this
Oh,
is not a
yeah.
grant proposal.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a very clear answer. You want to show that you have some level of technical detail, but you would not go into all of the detail there. So again, get the big picture across, show that you have a specific method or preliminary result or something, but you really want to be brief. Okay, and I see more questions popping in, but yes, please feel free to interrupt me as they come in. So yeah, I think it's important to be specific. So again, I have a specific example from my postdoc's research statement, but I edited, instead of just improve the energy efficiency, saying improve the energy efficiency by X%. So again, like some little details that really show that you're familiar with the field. And then making sure that you emphasize your first author papers and explicitly state if you've published papers in top tier journals. So maybe that's, something very general like Nature, Science, PNAS, or maybe it's very specific to your field, like the Journal of Fluid Mechanics or JFM if you work in fluid mechanics. And then if you have experience setting up a lab, like being someone's first PhD student or helping your PI move to a different lab, which is what I did, really emphasize these skills because you want to show that you know what it's like to move to a different institute, to put together floor plans, to think about what is, the first series of equipment and materials that you order for the lab. So do you know what it's like to work at different universities, whether it's different finance systems, purchasing, designing your lab, etc. So really kind of highlighting those specific skills that you have. And then again, make sure you tell a story. This should be a fun creative exercise for you guys as well. So you're emphasizing what the point of your research is, but you're crafting that narrative that connects your past and future. And I write, even if this is retconned, because again, people's paths are nonlinear and that's totally okay. I think you can just think about, okay, if I had these 5 disparate elements in my past. How can I tell somewhat of a roundabout story to see why I'm interested in the research that I'm proposing in the future, why I want to be a PI and have my own lab, whether that's mentoring students or you're so interested in, your particular research project. And just think about how has your journey led you to where you are and what do you want to do in the future. So again, this should be fun. I know it's a very stressful time, but really try to enjoy it as much as you can. And that's easier said from the other side of things, of course, but I think it's a really fun exercise in figuring out these are the things that have happened in the past. How am I going to pose this in the best possible story for the search community? So the next couple of slides will be examples from my research statement, but I see some more questions popping up.
We have a question on providing tips for a screening interview.
Okay, yes. So, at that point, people will have liked your research statement, your teaching statement, your CV enough. So I think it's important for a screening interview to show that you're really excited about that particular place. So again, emphasizing why you and why that particular university, painting that picture of why you would be a good colleague there. And then again, those little personal touches of, I want to collaborate with this person. I see that they have this computational model that would work very well with my experimental system. And so like that could be a nice tie there. Also thinking about, what specific courses at that university you could teach. You could talk about your mentoring philosophy. I want to have 3 PhD students, and I really want to give them each, an hour of my time every week. Those kind of specifics. So that's where you paint a picture of yourself holistically as a future faculty member and not necessarily just the research. The search committee might ask you a lot of questions about your research, so you do want to have strong answers for what you've done in the past, but also what your initial and long-term research projects are. So be prepared for any type of question.
It's a great answer, Nicole. There's one other question here that's dealing with the search committees or the hiring committees. How heavily do they lean into publications? Okay. And so maybe your research project took a longer time, or you switched things around, and so you didn't get as many publications out, or maybe you applied for highly competitive conferences or publications. So what is that ratio that they're looking at? I know that there is impact factor when you're doing publications, so there's that, but I don't know if the search committee is really honing in on newly hired coming in faculty. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, again, it really depends on the search committee, and I would say that is probably more discipline specific. So I know a lot of computer science departments look at people with, 5 to 10 papers from their PhD minimum, whereas that's very hard for me to do as an experimentalist, even as a faculty member with multiple students. So yeah, I think it's very discipline specific, but in general, people understand if you're just coming from your PhD that you probably won't have 20 publications. So emphasize what you do have. If there are more papers in the works, I would definitely talk about those as well. But I don't think it's not one factor that will cut you from the list. And so I think, again, you want to talk about your publications, you want to talk about the impact of your research, but it's a good opportunity to kind of think about you as a holistic researcher. And so maybe if you're interested in faculty positions and also postdocs, you can say like, I would like to, expand my my knowledge of this other research area so that I can, combine what I've previously done with some new skill and, create this other subfield. So again, that's just a roundabout example, but there's ways of kind of framing yourself in a positive light.
Thank you, Nicole. All right. We will keep going with the questions as we going, but Nicole, you want to finish up some slides before we
Sure,
these
yeah.
might answer some of these questions that are sitting here.
Yeah, so I'll give some examples from when I was a postdoc at the Naval Research Lab. And so, my research statement was about 3.5 pages in total. And I will say that this is my baseline. So I did not tailor it to a specific university in these examples on the slides. But when I submitted to certain universities, I definitely emphasized other things as well. But, here I have, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse. I had the header, which was my name and where I currently was at the time. I have the title, research statement. And so this is the introduction. So I also want to emphasize that this is not a perfect example. And your research statement will have your own personal touches. So don't try to copy another exact format or style because everyone has their own kind of personal touches. So yeah, I have a header and footer. I have my name, letterhead, page number, etc. Formatting, again, pretty general information. And then this introduction really highlights some of the motivation of my work, what the state of the art is. So what traditional methods for ocean monitoring are, how my research fits in. I did have a little bit more background as well because I am an interdisciplinary researcher. And so I wanted to talk about ocean applications as a big picture motivation, but also, what I specifically do in this newer subfield that I'm in. And then ending with saying what I'm going to do in general. And, I use here my cross-disciplinary research. So I was really trying to emphasize all the key areas of my research statement to set people up for the rest of my statement. And then from here, I have my previous and current work. So you can see I have a figure that's pulled from one of my papers. I have the figure caption here. So we have a title. Things are well labeled. I think things are spaced relatively well. If I were to go back and change anything, I would make the scale bar a little bigger and clearer. So these are just minor things that I would do now as a faculty member that I didn't realize as a student. But I have clear section headings here, so bolded text for major sections. I have bolded and italicized sections for each specific project. And from there, I emphasize what is the main takeaway from my previous research. I talk about some of my papers. So I had, a paper published in Science Advances. I had other things in the works. I talked about press. But this is certainly something that I didn't have when I was, graduating as a PhD student. It's something that I built up throughout my postdoc as well. So yours may or may not look like this as well. And then I have more previous and current work. So, a summary of various research contributions. So I had 3 projects that I talked about here, some more figures, and then really think about what skills did I develop during my project that would be applicable as a new faculty member. So here I say I developed expertise in a number of skills. So I built things, I did some computational modeling, I did some field work, I have collaborators. Again, I established new labs during a lab move. So I'm trying to show that I have expertise in some of these areas. Yeah, and grants and funding, make a case that you're familiar with applying to fellowships. I think I wrote, yeah, I helped develop a grant proposal with my former PI. Collaborations, making sure that you can work well with other people. So showing that you have previous collaborations is nice. Again, you don't need to have any of these elements, but if you do, try to emphasize it. And also just make sure that your contribution is clear. So if you have collaborations in all of your projects, then the search committee might ask, okay, but what did you do? And so this is the opportunity in your writing to say, I specifically did X, Y, and Z. And then things like mentoring as well. So I have a line about helping mentor a Trident scholar. And then for proposed work, again, I have section headings here for different types of proposed work. I have general information about various projects and what my overall research vision is, but then emphasizing, what is my short-term project? So when I first start off as a faculty member, what will I give to a first PhD student versus long-term research vision. So you want to talk about both the short and long term. So leverage your previous skills. You can talk about learning new skills and expanding your work too. And then my examples are not split into short and long-term projects. So that's, again, something that you guys can improve on. I just had 2 ideas that I fleshed out. And then at the end of my research statement, I had a summary of my research vision and future goals. So really emphasizing the big picture of my work. Okay, more questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I was in the middle of writing answer one.
Oh,
Let's see. I'm trying to see because when I started, everything just shifted on my
Yeah.
screen.
oh my
We
God.
It's like, wait, I'm typing.
Yeah,
What the-
sorry.
It's
This might be
okay.
my fault. Why don't
That's
we do
okay.
one of the questions that got a couple of upvotes here at the
Okay. Yeah.
beginning from Holly, who asks, how about things you should emphasize in a research statement if you're trying to transition from a teaching position to a tenure track position?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say emphasizing, acknowledging your past as teaching faculty and then saying, you do realize now that you want to focus more in research and, pulling in what you've previously done in your PhD would be helpful in trying to expand those. But also, did you learn something from teaching your classes that made you think, okay, I want to do some research in this new area that I didn't do previously? And again, there's ways of framing that so that you're saying, okay, it was a natural transition for me to go into teaching because it was something something that I was so passionate about. But in teaching, I realized this research area is another thing that I want to expand. So the nice thing about a tenure track position is that you have teaching and research. So I think talking about both of those as a synergy is helpful for you.
Mhm. Okay.
We also have someone with their hand raised. Sudipta, we are gonna have to like promote you up on the front here to ask your question if that's okay. Um, so I'll move you up to the front here if you still wanted to ask that question. Or maybe it was an accidental hand raise. Okay, why don't we move on to other questions in the meantime? Beth, did you want to address the one that you were in the middle of answering?
I'm still typing on that one.
Ah,
But that's
gotcha.
okay. So how do you find the balance between telling your personal narrative but maintaining an academic tone? Okay. And so I think some of that comes with maturity, but you want to have that authentic type of thing, but you want to obviously come across professional. So how you balance that?
Yeah, I think
Mm.
that's great. And that's very relevant as I pulled up the summary of the key elements at the very bottom. I
Mhm.
wrote be authentic and don't worry about what other people are doing. I think it's not helpful to think about, competition. There's going to be hundreds of people who apply to each of these academic positions. And that's okay because you are great and you've done your own unique types of research, teaching, service. And I think as long as you are passionate about something and that comes across in your writing, that's kind of the key element there. So again, making sure that your tone is very professional when you talk about your past research projects or your future research. It has a very, like just a normal professional academic tone. But I think in the introduction or the conclusion is where you have an opportunity to really say like, okay, this is kind of my personality though, and I'm going to show that here.
Mhm.
Mhm.
We do
And
have
can I
another
add
hand.
something
Oh,
to
go ahead,
that?
Tammy.
Okay. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, I like to when thinking about your research, and it sounds like a lot of you all are getting. I know you get caught in that. Oh, is it a research proposal and all of that? But I also when you're really just telling the story, like Nicole has already said, and writing a narrative about what's significant about your the significance of what you're doing, and that's what should be coming across. Why? And I always what I tell my people all the time is this is your who cares statement. It's like who cares? And I always say, imagine if there was a giant hole in the universe and you and all of your research and everything that goes along with it were to fall into that hole, what's now going to be missing? What's now not gonna the world what is the world gonna be missing? So think about it in those terms, and I love what Nicole just said about being authentic. So yes.
Yeah, and maybe before we go into other questions, I did want to get into a little bit of a like more personal part of this talk too, because I remember all the anxieties applying to different faculty positions and feeling like I wasn't good enough. And so I guess a couple of quick things that I wanted to say, you're seeing everyone else's highlight reel. So this is a bunch of press that I got towards the end of my PhD, but I felt like crap for the majority of my PhD because I didn't have any publications until basically the end of my PhD and then a couple of years afterwards as I was finishing writing things up. But it takes a really long time. And so this is what everyone else saw, but then I was living my own behind the scenes. So many of my experiments failed, sometimes for months at a time. Took me years to publish my first paper. All I heard was no. So here are examples of emails that I've gotten that are like, no, we're rejecting your paper. No, we don't want to we're rejecting your proposal. And this is just very common. And now as a faculty member, I realize that it's even more common. I'm told no even more times, but now I have more projects to spread myself over. So really, I wanted to emphasize you're doing fine. No one really talks about all the problems that they go through. Life is really tough. And so just figure out how you can find that good work-life balance. So I have some pictures here of like my sister's cat, like my fiance and me, a card that someone handmade for me. Um, And I think it's just important to find balance, be authentic, have some sort of thing that makes you passionate and enthusiastic, whether it's, going to concerts. So like this is a Shawn Mendes concert and here's me in the front row, but like figure out what works for you in your life. And so I also wanted to pull up some additional resources, but yeah, happy to field more questions now.
Okay, so Nicole, absolutely. It's the persistence and the resiliency that's part of the journey. And so I mean, how many, I can't even remember how many jobs I applied when I was looking to. It's just, and I just kept thinking it's not a rejection, it's just a redirection. It's not the fit for me. It's not the, don't
Yeah.
take it personal. It's really hard because it's personal, it's your journey. And but my mantra was it's not a rejection, it's just a redirection. Something else is going to be better. Something else is going to be better. And so I agree with what you said there because that's where it comes in. So I was looking at a couple upload questions that got a little more likes. And so here was one about someone who was applying for a position in a college and that would require a joint appointment. And so how do you, that would, the joint appointment would be research and the other one would be more on the liberal arts side of the house. And what happened to the question? It just went away. And then, so how would you indicate that in your research statement? Because, it's a joint appointment, so you're going to obviously teach, on one side and the other. So how would you indicate that?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that probably makes the most sense to highlight in the cover letter. If you did want to talk about that in your research statement, I would, talk about that maybe either towards the beginning or towards the end. But when you're thinking about, the future research that you would do, you could acknowledge, okay, as part of my joint appointment here, the research side of my job would be blah, 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 blah. And so just making things very clear, but putting it in a positive light, I think is important when writing these statements.
Mhm. Excellent. Tammy, did you see any of your questions? Or you're looking at one that's really resonating with you?
Maybe I thought I saw one. They keep going
I
away.
know they move faster than I can.
Um, if there's none standing out, we did have someone who had their hand raised and has a question in the
Okay, we got
which
just a
it might be the same question that's
couple
in the
minutes
Q&A
left.
here.
Yeah.
So, we have a question from Teresa. I'm an implementation scientist with a DBH. I don't have a PhD research background, but I developed an evidence-based intervention that has been implemented by others and has improved behavioral health outcomes. How is this type of applied work viewed in relation to traditional research pathways?
Mhm. Yeah, I think as long as you can emphasize what impact your research has, I don't think it matters so much. I would just say look for the specific job call and see if a PhD is required or not. But I mean, frankly, there are really great researchers who don't have PhDs as well. And I think, that's totally valid. I think as long as you can talk about your research well, that's really all that matters.
Mhm. I agree. I'm a non-tenure faculty and I do a lot of applied research. It's come because I'm teaching faculty. And so if you can clearly communicate that, I don't think you have a problem with that. Zoe, I
Yeah.
know we're at the end of top of
This,
the hour, so
Yeah, we want to be
yeah.
respectful of everyone's time, and we're at
Time.
the top of the hour here. So I just want to say a big thank you to Nicole and Tammy and Beth, for being our facilitators and our speaker. I just want to remind everyone again that I'll be sending out these slides after the session. Um, if you have any questions still that went unanswered, you can look through the slides. Nicole, would you be comfortable sharing your email? It looks like it's on the
Yes.
slide.
Yeah, so I pulled up my last slide, which has my contact information, but you can also find me online. And yeah, feel free to ask me whatever
Mhm,
questions.
mhm,
All
All
right, thank you so
right.
much.
Thanks
mhm.
so much, everyone. I'm gonna stop the recording here.
yay.